Okay, I think we're going to get started in 2 minutes with the next panel. Okay, I think we'll get started with our first panel on grid modernization. I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists. Their bios are in the materials here. And Joshua Epel is the chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. Ann McCabe is a commissioner with the Illinois Commerce Commission. Sue Tierney is senior advisor at the Analysis Group and is planning to move to Colorado, which is a wonderful move for all of us. Adrian Tuck, the Chief Executive Officer at Tendril Energy. So we're really happy to have them here with us. The objective of the panel is to investigate what's happening in the area of grid modernization and specifically ongoing efforts in various states and localities to modernize local distribution systems in order to facilitate the so-called smart grid and to promote distributed energy resources, which sort of sets the stage for some of the discussion for the rest of the afternoon. We're particularly interested in exploring different approaches to grid modernization under different regulatory models, restructured states, traditional cost of service states, hybrid states, and the use of innovative approaches to rate design and cost recovery to promote investments, the implications for business models, for utilities, and third parties. The panelists obviously have great expertise and experience with various states, Colorado, Illinois, Massachusetts, which we'll obviously draw upon. But we will surely bring in some discussion of what is happening in other leading states such as California and New York, as well as a more general discussion of changing regulatory and business models and the challenges and opportunities of distribution system investments across the power sector. Just so we all have a sense of the scale of investments required to modernize various aspects of the grid and the distribution system in particular, and the challenges of cost recovery given the changes that are taking place in the sector. I just want to throw out a couple of numbers. So there's about $1 trillion invested in fixed capital in the U.S. electric power grid from generation, bulk transmission, local distribution systems. And we are in the midst of a pretty significant investment cycle among investor-owned utilities, with investments happening across the system. Investor-owned utilities are investing upwards of $80 billion a year. Much more is needed, obviously, to modernize the grid and take advantage of new technologies and meet new regulatory requirements. If we look at the distribution system, that is the sort of local radial systems that is delivering power to end users in thousands of localities around the country, this is arguably the most dynamic part of the system today, as Tony Clark was discussing, given the remarkable growth of distributed energy resources, the efforts to create an advanced metering, smart grid infrastructure, et cetera. One estimate that I found, the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, estimates that we need roughly $250 to $400 billion to modernize this part of the system and achieve a fully functioning smart grid. I'm sure there are other estimates out there, but the bottom line is this is expensive. It's expensive for utilities, for ratepayers, for third parties, and all of us, I think, need to think hard about regulatory models, new rate designs, cost recovery, and incentives to promote these kinds of investments and what that means for the sector. So let me turn to the panel, and I'm going to start with you, Sue Tierney, given your experience as a commissioner in Massachusetts, your work in the federal government and the private sector, and your ongoing efforts on electricity regulation around the country. What do you see first as the most interesting policy experiments underway on grid modernization around the country? And then could you tell us a bit about what Massachusetts is doing, particularly in the area of rate design and cost recovery, to promote new investments in the distribution system and to move residential customers to dynamic rates?
Thank you, William. You guys don't know how lucky you are to have Professor Boyd here in Colorado. But thank you so much for including us on this panel. It's very nice for me. I got to sleep in my new house in Colorado last night. That was fun. But let me start. Actually, I'm going to flip the order, if it's okay, of the topics that William just asked me to talk about. I have been in Massachusetts for 3 decades. And let me give you a little bit of context about Massachusetts so that you can get a sense of how different it is from Colorado. But I think you're going to hear themes coming through the discussion, certainly with Commissioner Commissioner Clark. I'm sure you've never had a moment like I just had, right? Where there's just a lot of common themes about transitions that are underway. It is a hugely dynamic thing. So Massachusetts is part of a 6-state, very small geographic region. I'd say it's about maybe about 15% of the population in the United States. The 6 states have, since the blackout in 1965, operated as an interstate grid that is organized and collectively operated. Today it's operated by a single grid operator who has control over the dispatch of power plants across the region. Around 1997, customers, very large industrial customers, were pushing for change. They didn't like the rates. They were trying to get special rate discounts. That was creating all sorts of turmoil. And in fact, it was a precursor of the things that we're seeing in a number of parts of the country today. And Massachusetts is one of the states where the utilities sold off their power plants. They are now wires only and pipes only companies. Customers have choice. They can either take a default service from the utility or they can buy and shop in the marketplace. It is a heavily natural gas dependent region because the smog that has historically been in New England caused New England to have to clean up its power supply before other parts of the country. So we've got this very competitive market and with interesting dynamics going on. Just a couple more factors. Massachusetts has passed a Global Warming Solutions Act with trajectory of emissions reduction for carbon 80% by the year 2050, so they're on target to be moving that downward. There is a law that requires a lot of access for distributed energy resources. So there's a lot of things that are going on. Massachusetts has a goal of about 10% of its load to be supplied by solar by the year 2020. So maybe that's enough context at the moment. Starting in about the year 2012, Massachusetts started a process to look at grid modernization. They opened up an investigation like many states do. They brought in a collaborative. A lot of people worked through different issues. And the discussions ended up veering toward what can be the role of our wires company in enabling a much more vibrant two-way system of power supply so that customers could be injecting power into the grid just as from solar panels. By the way, my house here has a solar panel, so I'm so excited. And my husband, who never cares about electricity, is constantly checking on his big app about how much we're producing. It's pretty funny. So there's a lot going on, and yet Massachusetts doesn't have advanced meters yet to be able to track in real time what's going on. So there's a lot of things that have to happen. In 2014, Massachusetts adopted a new default rate for residential customers, and it would move everybody to a time of use rate that would be buttressed by the adoption of advanced meters so that people would see in real time. You know, in the New England market, there is second by second reporting quite transparently about what's going on in the wholesale markets. And this would send a signal to customers about the price of electricity at certain times of day. So customers may opt out of that rate design, but they have to take affirmative action to get back to flat rates. And the flat rates will be accompanied by a mechanism that will provide a rebate for customers who can lower their usage on peak. So they'll be part of a rate credit to do that. So this was part of what I'll call kind of a democratization, customer choice, driven in part by a lot of people pushing to get their own control of things in their energy systems. We have really high prices of electricity in Massachusetts, by the way. And then there's kind of a different thing going on that creates really I'd say a pause on everything I just described. And that is that, as Commissioner Clark described, Massachusetts the region is heavily dependent on natural gas. He described those forward prices for gas of $20 as opposed to $2 in other parts of the region. We're close to supply, and yet those prices are crazy. So over the last 2 years in parallel, there's been a shift from how do you democratize the electric system and enable customers to do things to, wow, we've got to build lots of big pipes and lots of big wires. So there's a new and controversial set of activities going on about how the electric wires customers can be a counterparty through their utility of signing up long-term contracts for gas pipeline capacity. And the reason is that in our region, the structure of that wholesale market does not induce power generators to sign up for firm transportation of gas into the region. And without that, you can't really build gas pipeline capacity. And so there's now this probably legal, it will be tested legally about whether that's kosher to charge electric consumers for power for building pipelines that will be actually accessed by power generators in the winter time period. The other thing we're doing is also trying to build big highways of transmission to Canada, where there's hydroelectric capacity. And both of those two things that I described, of building big pipes and big wires, are being offered as a way to reduce prices of electricity. I don't know that that actually jives and works out when you figure it out on paper. But so now we have these two tensions between big infrastructure, big investment, layering on a lot of cost to the user of the grid, both pipelines and wires, at the same time that we're creating incentives for people to leave the grid. So there's really interesting questions about where the money adds up across all of these things. I'm going to just leave it at that. This I think is we're almost like the canary in the mine on large dependency on natural gas, desires to move for distributed energy, as well as big wires, big infrastructure, a lot of investment to enable a lot of movement of power and gas in a region. A lot of other parts of the country are going to be having that. And I think there's a lot of tension about the extent to which technology, which we'll hear about, is driving and pushing these changes, and regulation is kind of catching up, or whether regulators can lead on some of these things. And that's hard to do in institutions which are driven by 100 years of legal precedent, and among other things. So maybe I'll stop there, William, and look forward to questions.
Want to say anything about other sort of experiments around the country that you find particularly exciting or interesting in this area of grid modernization, very briefly, or we can come back to that if you
Yes. One of the things that is going on in both in Baltimore and in California is trying to use big data that's offered by the utility, and those happen to both be situations where the utility is a wires company, or predominantly a wires company, and they are painting the maps of their systems with, they're almost heat maps, to try to identify to customers about where the value of investing in distributed energy resources really provides value back to the system. If you're building and adding solar here, it's not so good for the system, and therefore its value and the payment structure that you might have is not as attractive as if you're making your investment here. So far, a lot of the places around the country are like Massachusetts and like Colorado, where net metering is a blunter tool with regard to creating encouragement for investment in distributed resources. So there's a lot of work going underway, again by killer apps, to try to make it clearer about signals to customers in these markets about where it really might make sense for them to modulate their behavior if we're interacting with the system.
That's great. And we'll come back to this larger issue of how this is all going to get paid for and the tension. Sarah, beautiful setup. So Chairman Epel, I want to turn to you. Very different kind of state, Colorado, a traditional cost of service state that is witnessing significant growth in distributed generation. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, though, is that the distribution system investments historically have not really been a major focus of the PUC. And although there was obviously some issues with Smart Grid City a few years back, and I'm sure there are other examples, but how is that changing, and how is the Colorado PUC and the legislature approaching the challenge of grid modernization and thinking about the distribution system in particular? And are you thinking about new approaches to cost recovery and new rate designs? Are you keeping an eye on what's happening in other states? Are you content with where things are and how things are here?
Well, let me start with this. I'm always keeping my eye on other states, and when one of my good friends says prices are crazy, nobody should ever say that about Colorado or the West. I really have to start with my bureaucratic disclaimer. I have to do this, and I'll be as candid as I can. One, I'm not speaking for the commission. These are my own opinions, and I'm not going to be able to speak about open dockets. But I will get as close as I can, because really this is an important topic, not only for the audience, but in particular for the law students. And I also have to point out, starting off, is we have a real treasure that's just moved to Colorado, which is Sue Tierney. Yes. With being candid, the Colorado Renewable Energy Standard was sued by a right-wing group out of Washington, D.C., and Sue Tierney provided our expert report, and this case was thrown out by the District Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court has just denied cert. But for those of you law students, one, I think if you want to get one of the best primers on how the grid and renewable energy works, Sue Tierney's report for the commission, expert testimony, is a public document. It's worth reading. And if you ever want to study the issue of standing and how the court allowed this group, ALI, have standing, to me, is That's bordering on the ridiculous. But that's the law of standing, so that's a whole different topic than.
We have people that can do that.
Let me start with your question. I'm going to go about it in a roundabout way, because I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, what's your objective? What is it you are trying to achieve? In Colorado, we've taken a very deliberate path to really reducing our carbon footprint in our electric generation, and actually I'd say with our gas distribution, but also, going back to Sue's points, at reasonable rates. And so in the last few years, we've focused very much on the Colorado Clean Air, Clean Jobs program. It cost $1 billion to reduce, to basically eliminate or substitute 900 megawatts of coal generation with either renewables or fuel switching. We did that with almost no rate impact to Colorado. We've increased wind dramatically, utility scale solar, 120 megawatts. We've increased communities' solar gardens. We have created a thriving rooftop solar industry while also lowering costs to ratepayers. We've significantly, because this all has to be looked at together when you're looking at it from a regulatory point of view, is we've had to authorize significant pipeline safety programs to protect against the really terrible circumstances we've seen in San Bruno, in Harlem, and other places. So when we're looking at it and saying, how does it, what do we do about the distribution system? This is what we're always looking at. So this is not really for bragging rights, because I think when you look at the entire country and who has showed real leadership, and I didn't even talk about energy efficiency, Colorado has done it while at the same time keeping rates really reasonable. And that's sort of been our focus. Now, we're doing a number of interesting, I think both, you, Professor Boyd, talked about experiments. And one of the things we're looking at are some really innovative projects. We're looking at some pilot scale projects on distributed generation. And these are really interesting because they're not just the utility, but the utility in partnership with private enterprise, the state government, Colorado Energy Office, and Panasonic. That's an innovative new approach. We're looking at things called voltage optimization. But I will tell you that every one of these projects we're talking about, there are people coming and opposing them. So nothing in this business is ever not contested. And that goes back to Commissioner Clark's point of view, which is if you're looking at energy and you're not talking about politics and everybody's political, you're kidding yourself. So that's a key decision. So at the commission, we're really trying to ask what's the priority of the state of Colorado? And we have, I think, a very clear vision, and it really was started by the people of Colorado by implementing in 2004 a renewable energy standard, which was voted on by the people, and then we've built on that momentum, is really to get to a better, lower carbon future, while at the same time reliability is key, and our compact with our citizens is their expectation is reasonable rates, because you've got to look outside the Front Range when you talk about Colorado. The population's here, but there are a lot of communities in which, and there's pockets within the Front Range where people really are having to make that terrible choice between food, medicine, and energy. And so that's the perspective one has to take. So to get to your point, I think we've been tackling grid modernization slowly, deliberately, but in the context of how do we modernize the entire system and make sure that this whole range of new approaches is done as thoughtfully as possible.
Thank you. No, that's great. Switching to you, Commissioner McCabe, Illinois enacted an Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act in 2011, has been a real leader in adopting new rate designs to encourage investments in the grid. Can you tell us a little bit about the Illinois model and the Illinois experience and the lessons you've learned over the last several years as you've rolled out this program?
Yes, and I'm happy to be here. I want to note that Chairman Epel was one of the first out-of-state commissioners I met after I became a commissioner about 4 years ago. And like him, I'm going to say these are my thoughts, and I can't speak about open dockets. I don't think we'll get into that. But just background, Illinois is a restructured, competitive state. We also have municipal aggregation, where munis can choose their own supplier. We have an energy efficiency and renewable portfolio standard. We're in 2 regional transmission organizations, PJM and MISO. The southern part of the state's in MISO, and we're the only fully restructured state in an RTO of vertically integrated states, which creates some very interesting situations. We're 50% nuclear, 40% coal, and Exelon says 3 of our 6 nuclear plants are at risk given natural gas prices, renewables, and so when you think about the Clean Power Plan compliance, that's very significant. Illinois has the most nuclear generation of any state in the country. And so, yes, back in 2011, the Illinois legislature passed the Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act, also known as EIMA, or formula rate. It authorizes our 2 big electric utilities, ComEd and Ameren, to participate in formula rate making for 1 to 10 years and provide cost reconciliation for nearly $3.2 billion of qualifying infrastructure investments. That includes grid hardening, infrastructure upgrades, things like interrupters, which reroute power when there's a fault along the line, and smart meters. I'll note that Illinois is doing advanced metering. Before, we're doing utility of the future, where Massachusetts and New York are doing utility of the future, and they don't have advanced meters in place yet. Each state and region is different. So under formula rate, in April, the utilities file to reconcile their actual costs from their FERC Form 1 and to increase rates by the projected plant additions for the next year. January 1st, the new rates go into effect. And June 1st, the utilities report each year on the achievement of metrics and any proposed penalties, which the Commission must decide by December 1st. We're in the 5th year of formula rate implementation. There are reliability, customer benefit, and diversity-related metrics. I would not call what Illinois is doing performance-based regulation in the sense of RIO and true PBR, which is like multi-year rate cases. I think our formula rate is kind of a step along a continuum, and I think that's one of the reasons we've kind of been talking about what to do on utility of the future, and there's 3 bills pending in Springfield that would do that for us. There's one, a Clean Energy Jobs bill. ComEd has a bill that would do things like allow them to do microgrid pilots, community solar, and demand charges. And Exelon's proposed a bill that would create a low-carbon portfolio or clean energy standard, which would help the at-risk nuclear. Some observations on how this has gone to date. ComEd accelerated its deployment of advanced meters after the first few years because it realized it could do so less costly and be more efficient and actually increase the net present value of the total smart grid expenditures. On the metrics side, like I said, formula rate participants have to meet or exceed certain metrics: reliability, customer benefit, and diversity. If they fail, they risk a reduction in their basis points. These metrics are one way. That's another difference, I think, with PBR. People talk about symmetrical incentives. There's sticks if they don't meet the metrics. There's no carrots if they exceed them. And that's something pending legislation would address as well. So in the last few years, ComEd has failed twice to meet one metric, the 75% improvement in service reliability targets. And that's resulted in a reduction in their return on equity of 5 basis points, which is about $2 million. But that's based on an annual revenue requirement of $2.4 billion. So that's $2 million penalty on $2.4 billion. So the fact that only one metric has not been met in recent years twice kind of raises questions about how difficult the metrics are to meet and how punitive is 5 basis points. Going forward, we're going to be dealing with rate design issues. How should utilities recover their costs while not reducing the incentive to reduce electricity consumption? How do you balance between fixed and volumetric charges? And how do you move from a usage-based volumetric charge to a demand-based volumetric charge, and what impacts will that have on energy efficiency, self-generation, and storage. So setting the right metrics is important. We may want to look at the metrics and tweak those. For example, maybe seconds interrupted is a better measure than KD or SAFE, which is duration and frequency. And I think I will stop there and answer questions later.
So let me just ask one follow-up then. What was there a concern with symmetrical incentives, as you say, or carrot and stick, or was this just the way it evolved? I mean, why not have kind of true performance-based rates built into this from the beginning? Because it sounds like you're saying that's where things are headed potentially.
Right. I wasn't part of those negotiations. I know that the consumer groups added additional metrics, but I don't know why, or maybe it was just maybe it was a lightning rod back then to have anything that would reward the utilities. But I think in the intervening time, given the discussion, regionally and nationally, that may have changed.
And I assume the utilities are pushing for
ComEd talks about it a lot. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So we'll come back to some of these broader questions about rate design. Thank you so much, Commissioner McCabe. Adrian, I want to turn to you. Tendril has been a player in the smart grid energy intelligence space for years, with a particular focus now on consumer behavior, data, and analytics, much of it focused at the household level. How do you view, from your perspective, the challenge of modernizing local distribution systems, and where should distribution system investments be going based on your experience and what you're doing with Tendril?
Sure.
And then maybe a little bit about the respective role of utilities, regulators, and third parties in all of this.
So today, we're just about to pass the point where 200 million times a month somebody somewhere in the world interacts with the Tendril system to see their energy. That could be a consumer looking at a bill, could be your husband looking at his solar panel production, somebody looking to buy a house and predicting the energy consumption of that house. And so we see an awful lot of consumer activity on our systems, activity around energy, when presented in the right way, in the right context. And we get to, during we do during the customer journey, experience feedback from customers about what they like and don't like about their supply of energy. And one of the things that we've learned is, notwithstanding Commissioner Epel's point about low income families really struggling to pay their bills. That's a very, very real problem for a significant number of people. For the rest of the country, when you present that your energy bill is roughly the same as the price of a cup of coffee at Starbucks on any given day, and that powers your whole house, people start to realize that they get unbelievable value out of this system for the price that they pay. And we get staggering results when we present energy bills in that context, right? That it's roughly $5 a day or thereabouts, which is similar to what many of us would pay in Starbucks for our latte. The drive to move pricing from a sort of fixed price consumption model to a time of use type pricing model meets with considerable resistance and is counter to what we get from our other service providers these days for the most part, right? So Netflix doesn't charge us more on a Saturday night to watch a movie than they do on a Tuesday afternoon. And they have very real capacity constraints in their system as well. But they do things with technology that, you see slightly more pixelation and various things like that. It takes slightly longer for the movie to start on a Saturday night than it does on a Tuesday morning. And so we have to be careful as an industry that we don't take the problems that are inherent in our network, that you can't store energy, that it has capacity constraints, that the prices fluctuate dramatically throughout the day, and just make them our customers' problem, right? By just saying, okay, we're just going to reflect this in price, and it's down to you to fix it. I think if we think that we're going to have a reasonable role in the grid of the future as it becomes more complex and more distributed, that smoothing out a lot of those bumps associated with how how consumption happens is going to be a critical role that we need to play. And so some of our utility customers are now moving fast to fixed price energy, just in the same way that you pay for broadband and so on, and using technology in the middle to manage the complexities of when does your house get cooled and when does your hot water heater run and so on. And so infrastructure and investment in infrastructure at the distribution level plays a part in that, because you can get rid of natural blocks, and the kind of data analytics that figures out where those congestion points are important. But I think we all have to be humble and recognize that innovation is going to happen at the edge of the grid, and we're not really going to be able to predict where the next electric vehicle is going to be bought or who's going to put the next solar panel on their roof. And so we're going to have to build a very adaptive model that says, okay, as we gain knowledge about where load patterns are shifting, we're going to have to build infrastructure quickly in order to support those pieces. And I think that, if I look at, we have big solar customers, distributed solar customers. They tell me that within 2 years, 85% of their solar panels will come with a battery. And so that will, in itself, and that in itself will change the nature of the curves that are coming off solar. And the reason it will come with a battery is because the solar guys are throwing the battery costs into the lease, and are selling resilience as one of the sort of benefits of the next generation solar systems. And so I think there's a danger that we build for today, and we don't recognize that there's still massive amount of innovation to go on at the edge of the grid, and therefore we have to concentrate on building flexible systems that can spot things when they're happening and react quickly, as opposed to pre-building infrastructure in the anticipation that today's technology turns up en masse tomorrow.
Do you think you can build that adaptive model here in Colorado?
I think so, yeah. And I think there are all sorts of bits of technology that you need in order to do it, but it's mainly a data science processing issue. I mean, today we deal with something like 2 terabytes of data an hour in our systems, which are looking at, very detailed localized weather forecasting, behavior of consumers, and what's happening on their systems. And in some cases, that's enhanced by smart meters, but it's not necessarily that you need smart meters in order to do some of this stuff. And so I want to be clear about that. For a long time, people sort of linked smart meters and smart grid together. I'm not sure that that's true today.
Mm-hmm. And I want to follow up too, and Sue, you may have some thoughts on this as well, on this resistance to time of use and dynamic rates among residential customers. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about this for decades. We have been talking about this for decades, and it's just not happening. Although, is the solution as simple as what Massachusetts is proposing, where we just change the default and we force people into this, we default people into this and then force them to opt out? Or is everybody going to opt out, or a bunch of people are going to opt out? And California, I think, is also thinking about the same kind of choice architecture for this. So Adrian or Sue or both of you may have some thoughts on this.
I think it's dangerous to force to have an opt-out model where you don't provide technologies that react to price signals, because then you're penalizing people who aren't at home and able to react to those price signals. And so that technology is just starting to emerge now, and specifically mainly around heating and cooling and hot water. And so I think you have to be careful that you don't just force this plan onto people without those kind of technologies. We have utilities in the U.S. who represent about 10 million homes or so, and they the forward-thinking ones are splitting their pricing programs into 3. So they're saying, as a default, you can just stay with the system that you've got. Every kilowatt hour you use, you'll pay for. For those people who want to become active in their consumption, then we will offer you a time of use rate so that you can take advantage of low prices at off-peak times. And then for those people who want bill surety, for whom budgeting is more important, you might pay a slight premium on the off months in order to have a flat bill. And we found, particularly in southeastern states, for example, people's bills can fluctuate by as much as 6x between a hot summer month and a cold winter month. And so giving a low-income family a level of bill surety by fixing their bill or capping their bill in our research, we've seen that over half of customers would pick that option if they were given it, pay a premium.
Thank you.
I apologize. The points that Adrian has just made about technology pushing customers and not reminds me of the different pathways that different states chose on this. Do you give customers the default of staying where they are and then opt in versus make everybody change or not? Very controversial because of the politics of energy. Very controversial because of the tendency to go to the lowest common denominator and the least, the population that's least able to make choices. But I think that Adrian really points out that in many parts of the country, people are beginning to think about large groups of customers in differentiated ways. I mean, in the past, residential customers are residential customers, and everybody faces the same price signals and tariff structures. And we know that all of the various things that you're describing of people who want to be actively participating, that's a completely different model than people who want to be able to plan. And not only are low-income customers interested in managing a budget, but more and more large industrial customers, big box stores, are really interested in signing long-term renewables contracts because they feel like they can have price surety in a number of ways. So thinking about customers in differentiated ways, I think is the new way in the future. And that's a big change for regulatory environments that are used to doing it the same old way for many, many decades.
That's a great opportunity for our regulators to perhaps share some thoughts on this, if you care to.
No, absolutely. I think this is a wonderful discussion, and I think one of Adrian's points, which is absolutely critical, is the amount of information out there and using that information to make wise decisions. But let's pick up on Sue's point on the large industrials. The large industrials, let's talk commercial, not industrials. And
sure.
We have to recognize the difference because in the Midwest, they much more, or there used to be a lot more heavy industry than we have in the West. Same thing with New England. So every state is different, every region is different. But when a large commercial customer whose fundamental business is to save costs comes to a regulator and say, oh, give us preferential treatment, give us a break at the expense of other people, then you're really violating fundamental principles of cost causation. It is absolutely in the business interest of a Walmart or a Target or a Sam's Club or whomever to use as little energy as possible and use it as wisely as possible. The minute they step over that line and say, well, we're really essential to your economy, we should have other people subsidize us, that's when there's a step too far. So I think making the conscious decisions in the commercial sector to say, I want to have a different energy profile, whether it's purchasing renewable energy for laudable goals or for corporate goals, which may be synonymous, is one thing. But it's really, we always have to get back to that compact of this is a state, this is a region. How do we do this as fairly as possible, making sure we're keeping track of, we've got some goals here, which is to have the most intelligent grid. I hate the term smart grid, but I think intelligent grid is so fundamental. There's so much information out there that we don't take advantage of to make these wise decisions, including which resources should we be allocating. If I can just do one more point.
Please.
One of the most fascinating developments, I think, in the country, which really has started here in Colorado, are these community solar gardens. Because those are wonderful resources that, if put in the correct spot, really helps with the reliability, the resilience. This is just a unique model which we're all paying attention to, and I think this is one of those incremental changes, which is the only way it happens in the energy business, which really is something to be watching.
And gives lower income
Absolutely.
residential users access to distributed energy in a way they may not have.
Absolutely.
Solar leasing models. Commissioner McCabe, did you have anything to add to this?
Yes, in Illinois, our advanced meters are an opt-out, but the goal for ComEd is 100%, and for Ameren is about 62% adoption. I think there's no question that advanced metering and grid hardening does result in a lot of benefits in terms of fewer outages, lower duration outages. On the flip side, on the customer side, though, there's still questions about how many customers are going to adopt time of use, demand response, other programs, and what's it going to take to get them there. Lisa and I were talking about this at lunch. Part of our legislation included about $5 million a year that goes to groups that go out to the communities and help educate them about meters. I don't think we're still in the process of finding out what that's going to be, but that's another question: is how do you make sure people, at least a certain portion of the customers, can benefit in terms of lowering their bill?
So we've heard a lot about various experiments going around the country, and I want to ask the whole group one last question and get your thoughts, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I want to sort of take a bigger picture here and think about the role of federal policy and supports for what is happening in various states, and ask you to reflect upon first, the diversity of regulatory and business models in the power sector that we're seeing because of the chaotic, messy system that we've inherited after restructuring with multiple different states, or different states operating under different models, and whether that actually does have certain benefits in terms of allowing for different kinds of experiments, the conversation we were having with Commissioner Clark. But more specifically, how, in your view, have federal policies and incentives, or how can they best work to support, guide, and even de-risk some of these experiments, right? So I'm thinking specifically of stimulus money that was used to deploy advanced meters around the country, but there are lots of other examples in the power sector, including very expensive loan guarantees and incentives for big generation or whatever. Is this an appropriate role for the federal government to play as we sort of think about the big transformations that are happening in the power sector, and how important is it in advancing policy experimentation and innovation? So maybe we'll start down there at that end, Adrian, with you, and work up.
So, you know, I both benefited and nearly died as a result of the last stimulus process. So, in other words, a huge amount of money flowed into smart meters, which allowed and allowed lots of utilities to experiment, which has driven a lot of innovation. Smarter people than me would have spotted that and perhaps not grown my company quite as fast during that process to then have to reorganize it when that money dried up. But I think, yes, the federal government has a role to play, or can have a role to play, and roughly in the way that it played it. In other words, when you look back on it, what they did was two things. They enabled, I think, large infrastructure projects that otherwise wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have happened as quickly on one end of the spectrum, which benefited incumbents. And at the other end of the spectrum, they underwrote incredibly risky technological bets in ways that perhaps the market wasn't ready to do yet. And that allowed new market entrants to gain a level of credibility. Tesla is a great example, right, to sort of penetrate the market faster because of the loan guarantees that they were able to get. Now, there are some failures in there as well, as there should be in any risky program. But providing the money is not only used to protect incumbent positions, but is also used to drive disruption. I'm supportive of it, and hopefully I'll be smarter about it the next time it happens.
Sue.
I'm going to start answering this question about the federal government by reminding everybody that the federal government is really the product of, well, what we think about the federal government is the product of a lot of different laws that affect the energy industry. I really said that in a bad way, so I apologize. What I mean to say is the way the federal government affects the energy production, delivery, and use systems is really differentiated. It's a tax program, tax incentives, the production tax credit we heard about from your little comment there, and I cannot believe that FERC would ever write that letter, by the way. Nice try. So taxation incentives play a huge role, and we know that one very well. You think about FERC's role, interstate commerce, assuring the flow of electrons and natural gas across state borders. addressing cybersecurity issues as they interact with having a lot more of the system be at the edge of the grid. There's really interesting questions there. FERC is right now really pushing the gas and electric industries to harmonize their two industries' communication systems. If the electric industry is relying on gas and more, and the electric industry is making decisions on, 5-second supply to make sure that the lights stay on, and the gas market operates on a 24-hour process and you cannot get the information going, that's a real problem. And so the role of somebody like FERC to enable those things really is important for the backdrop of having the system work. DOE is a really hodgepodge organization, so it's the federal government, but it's works on R&D. The ARPA-E program, Advanced Projects Research Administration, E for energy, is a really cool incubator of getting some. That's the group that funded Solyndra, but has and had famous problems as a result of that debacle. But most of the projects have had really high payoff of high risk, high return opportunities going forward. The DOE has the opportunity to use the power marketing administrations in ways that are very sleepy and not being utilized. So there's a lot of tools of the federal government. I haven't even mentioned the EPA rules and how they affect things. So energy policy, it is no surprise there ain't never going to be a national energy policy, because energy policy is a function of those derivative kinds of laws that are really goosing different parts of the system in different kind of ways. So I don't think in any person's lifetime that we are going to see a national energy policy that's a comprehensive suite.
Thank you. Ann.
Excellent points by Sue, and she's got much more federal experience than I do. I'll just chime in on a few things. On the stimulus money, one of the reasons Illinois had the EIMA legislation for formula rates is that we weren't allowed to use it for smart meters, and then they tried to get a rider, and the court struck down the rider, so then it was legislated. And just from talking to people that worked a lot in that program, I think that happened for certain reasons at that time, and it was a big influx of cash. Some states had trouble spending it. There were no next steps. I'm not sure a lot of it was that innovative. I think there is that federal standards on energy efficiency appliances, products, building codes are helpful in moving things along, in addition to a lot of states have energy efficiency portfolio standards, which also help. But I did hear that one of the more innovative projects had to do with a new Belgium brewery here. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. So.
We may have some new Belgian beer waiting over there at the reception tonight.
I'm trying to decide what type of identity crisis I'm about to have, whether I'm going to basically bring out my inner, whatever that guy from Oregon, Bundy, or that.
Yes. They're looking for reinforcement.
They are. Bring some snacks.
And go with the states' rights issue, or really go, instead of doing the negative, do it in the positive and talk about really what I think Justice Brandeis said, which is states are the incubators of innovation. Yeah. And I see a very limited role for the federal government to be effective. Now, FERC has a very key role, but we're not a regulated state or an RTO. But I look at what Massachusetts does. I look at California with glee because I learn a lot from them and I learn what not to do. But it's important because there are so many innovations taking place, and how do you follow them? And I think especially for the law students, the hardest thing to do is separate what is real versus what is a fad, and really be able to make those type of judgments of what really is going to help move us forward on a better energy policy incrementally. I think what Adrian's doing is so fascinating because it's a whole different way of looking at energy, and there are so many opportunities. It's very exciting. So I really look at what the states are doing and how do we sort the wheat from the chaff. Mm-hmm. The federal government, getting back to it, I think NREL and the national labs provide tremendous information, and they help us think differently, and they help us make sure we're not being parochial. I think that's the best function they provide. Because when you look at the federal government, and now we can really get into the politics of what happens in Congress, you look at some of these devices that are created like master limited partnerships. Well, that benefits the masters in the partnerships, and the unit holders don't do so well. And we're seeing those things kind of collapsing around us. So I think, you know, I'm going to go back to Adrian's term of we have to be humble and be really careful in how we move the ball forward, making sure that we understand what is our objective. Because there's a tremendous amount of wonderful things to be done, but we are going to make missteps. And how do you make sure the missteps are not one that really the ratepayers and the citizens of the state or the region are going to pay?
But having the federal government sort of throw money out for a program and letting states self-select if they want to come in and take advantage of some of these programs, perhaps, is that a problem? Colorado can go its own way if they don't want to go down that road necessarily. I mean, you've got Adrian's point about protecting incumbents versus driving disruption for sure.
But make it steady and consistent.
Yeah.
Make it a pot of money which people can honestly bid on and utilize and innovate with.
Yeah.
But when you just throw piles of stuff out, you're going to get what you get, which is piles of stuff without being thoughtful about it. And I think the federal government should be giving more money to the states. I'm not sure I feel qualified to direct where it is, but it's not convulsive, but it's what's a nice systematic approach. I mean, there are so many interesting innovations, and I think some of them are coming out of the national labs. An underutilized tool, which we didn't talk at all about today in distributed generation, is fuel cells. Fascinating technology. There's a lot of innovations. How do we get there and do it wisely, I think, is the biggest challenge for all of us from all of our different perspectives.
Great. So let's open it up for questions, and we will take a question from a student. Kevin, you have your hand up. You've composed yourself and got a job maybe by now.
Did you get one?
There's.
So I have a question that kind of builds off of William Boyd's previous question, except instead of focusing on the federal government, it's sort of about the states. And so given that we have 3 different state commissions represented up here, I'm curious as to what your view is on the role of policy frameworks and market structures on developing a more modernized grid. And so a better way of phrasing that might be, do you think that grid modernization is perhaps happening faster or more efficiently in restructured states with organized markets and retail competition versus sort of old school vertically integrated states like Colorado?
Good question.
I'll go first. I think you look at the Colorado model, we're doing better than in, I think, any other state. There are certain states who may be jumping ahead of us, say, temporarily in solar, but they're offering greater incentives. But you look at us, we've got 3 vibrant economies right now. We've got community solar garden, we've got utility scale solar, we've got different models of rooftop solar, all going on in one place. And I think that's because we've had a steady hand and say we're going to allow some innovation, but there's still going to be a budget for it. I can't speak for the others, but
That's because of the traditional cost of service model with the cost recovery and everything that is embedded in that. Okay?
That's what I believe.
Vote for the traditional cost of service model.
And I mean, Illinois is a restructured state, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle. So we have an energy efficiency and renewable portfolio standard. We have a lot of wind. Competition keeps prices down. We have lower prices than the surrounding vertically integrated states. But there's trade-offs. We have very little control over what the RTOs do, and that's more than 50% of the average customer's bill. So that and FERC.
You've asked a really good question, and I don't think that I don't think you can end up saying one or the other does it. I've done a lot of studies on different topics, and do restructured markets deliver more efficient prices versus traditional ones, and what's happened over history. And I think that there are other factors besides those big structural changes that matter here. One of them is truly the appetite of customers in a region to be pushing to get things going. Another is the environmental profile and pictures there. You think of Texas as a restructured market. They made everybody choose. There were no default suppliers. They got competition rolling, and they built out their transmission system in the good old-fashioned way of building on cost of service, basically. That's totally different than Illinois restructured market, totally different than New York and California. So I think that you've asked a really complicated question, and so too bad.
I would say we serve both types of, or the full spectrum of people, and I would say every fiber in my body wants to say that competitive retail states innovate the best, but it's not true. So, in other words,
The fiber right here.
So markets where there's real competitive retail, UK, Texas, for example, Australia, they've got fantastic amounts of innovation going on. So on one metric, they look really good, but their prices are high and their customer satisfaction is really low because there's all this stuff going on and all this churn, and it's not a steady hand at the tiller. And so I have to say on balance at this point that I think that the regulated states, as much as it pains me as someone who really wants to see competition in some of this stuff, have enabled a more even keel and a balance of innovation and steadiness that has done better in the 10 years I've been in this industry.
Chairman Epel and then Sue.
Let me also not take too much credit for what we do as regulators. A lot of the accomplishments in Colorado come either from the desire of the people of Colorado or from the legislature. I mean, Clean Air, Clean Jobs came out of the legislature. Mm-hmm. The Renewable Portfolio Standard came out of the vote of the people and was constantly increased by the vote of the legislature. It really reflects this state. And I think when you look at different states, it's hard to compare them because there are different cultures and there are different ethos. I think in Colorado we're very unique. I had a colleague from another country ask me, why is Colorado so different? I said, I can't tell you why we're so different from Utah or New Mexico or Wyoming, but we are. And it goes back to history. So to say our regulatory model is superior, I'd say the people of Colorado have said, we have a vision, now get us there. It's really, so I can only take a little bit of credit.
I was going to offer that one of the really challenging issues in the industry across the country is what is really the role of the utility going forward, whether it's generation down to distribution service or wires only. There's a lot of the things that we're talking about here where if a utility is supposed to be just an enabler of markets, they don't get to play in investment or packaging things in the same way that you might expect a utility to be able to do that packaging or portfolios in traditionally regulated states. And I don't think we're likely to see one answer to that question. New York is struggling with the fact that they want a utility to be like a grid operator and basically being the platform on which lots of apps can hang and that customers can interact. But a lot of those utilities also want to get in the game. Mm-hmm. And so can they use their monopoly functions to actually suppress competition or not? Those are really core questions that are facing the industry right now.
Kevin, that was a great question. I would hire you in a heartbeat just based on that question. I think I'm going to take the prerogative to ask, we'll have one more brief question, brief responses, and then we have a break. I'll go over here to Steve Hauser.
I promised to ask an easy question. So this is a little bit of the same issue from a different angle.
And can you introduce your...
Oh, I'm sorry. Steve Hauser, I'm the CEO of the Gridwise Alliance. We're a DC-based advocacy group advocating for grid modernization and have been for 13 years.
You live in
now.
Colorado, though, right?
I live in Colorado.
Yeah.
And glad to. I'm glad to have Sue in Colorado. So as we watch, as I watch grid modernization around this country, a lot of the real leading edge innovations occurring in the cities, not in the states, in municipal utilities. We've been talking mostly, understandably, about state regulated IOUs. But if you think of Chattanooga or Fort Collins or Glendale, California, or Jacksonville, or I mean, you can name a dozen or more cities who are very aggressively innovating in this space, not always in high-priced markets, many times in lower-cost markets, very sensitive to price, their citizens, very sensitive to service, you know, almost to some extent on the leading edge of what customers want. So what do we, I'm curious as to whether you agree with me, is that sort of the leading edge of innovation in this space? And if so, why are they innovating faster than the bigger IOUs in this space?
Great question to end on.
Great question. I think when I think of a lot of the real leading edge ones, I would add Austin, San Antonio, a variety of different places that are really doing experiments. And I don't know, it strikes me that you have this integration of decision makers with people who are voters as well as customers, and they're willing to collaborate on things, but that sounds like that's motherhood and apple pie. So I don't really know the answer to why. Great question. And I think we're likely to hear about it at Fort Collins.
That's my read, is organizationally they've got tighter decision-making trees, so they don't need to go for as much internal or external approval to get things done. And there's a shorter link between the guy at the top and of the municipality and the guy whose electricity is next door neighbor. So, so those things all mean tighter control. I would also say less, in many cases, less diversity, and I mean in terms of rural versus urban and density and so on. So they don't have to balance, you know, something that's going on here with something that's going on 60 miles up in the mountains and think about how I'm going to do those things differently. They tend to be geographically confined.
Just in case anybody doubts this, there are real municipal slugs out there too.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I touched that last part, but you know, prior to coming to work for the government, when I was in private practice, I represented a lot of municipalities. And going back to this whole concept of crucibles of innovation, the cities are the closest to their people. They reflect the ethos of their individual city. And so if a city feels this way and their people feel that way, there's going to be a more compelling drive. I think the smaller the city, the easier it is to do. You know, Austin is not a vast metropolis, and it is truly a unique city in Texas. You don't see this happen in Houston or San Antonio, really, but it's, I think when practicing law, it was really fun to represent municipalities because they are so close to the needs of their people.
Any final thoughts, Commissioner McCabe? So please join me in thanking our panelists. That was great, really fun. And we have another, and then we'll reconvene for the second panel.